All right, thank you, and good morning. Yeah, so like Rachel said, I am Hidde. I work at Mozilla currently, where I'm in the open innovation team. I work on identity and access management, which is all about login flows. It has very little to do with CSS, and very little to do with what I want to talk about today, which is graphic design and the web. Now, the reason I got quite interested in this subject is that I attended a workshop. So this was an idea of Fantasy, who is someone who's written and contributed to so many different specs, like grid layout and Flexbox. And she came up with this idea of doing a workshop, but it wasn't the kind of workshop where you'd go and learn about how to use grid layout. It was the kind of thing where you would read the whole spec together. It might sound real boring, but it was actually really cool. We did this with a couple of people in Amsterdam. She organized a couple in the Bay Area, and we thought we'll do some here. And we started reading this whole spec, paragraph by paragraph, and kind of tried to find things that were interesting, maybe ask questions, and things that were unclear to us. So when I was in a train back on my way home, I thought it's not just going to cut it if I only know the CSS. I need to know a little more. I need to know more about graphic design, because this is going to touch our designs quite heavily. So I started to look at some books. I had a couple of books at home, because I always liked typography, but I never really applied it to the web. So I started reading a bit more about this, and I also looked at some of the books that I used to learn web development. So things like Bulletproof Web Design, Designing with Web Standards, of course, Eric's book was there. And a lot of these books, they teach kind of graphic design-y things to do in browsers, but they did this in a time where we didn't really have that many features in browsers, so we had to use quite a lot of hacks. And I think that has really changed in the last few years, and yeah, you could say it's a whole new era for design and layout on the web, because we have these new things that I'll be talking about today. So what's great graphic design? I may have really chosen the wrong word, because great is very subjective. But I was kind of thinking of the graphic design that we hear a lot about, or that kind of people look back to when they think about graphic design, the kind of icons of graphic design. Can we do these things in the browser? And specifically, I think modernist graphic design would be interesting to look at for us, because modernism is a fairly rule-based design philosophy, you could say, and that really fits what we're doing on the web. It's also a movement that kind of started as a response to industrialization, and that's really kind of something that matches our industry too, because they got a lot more machines around them, and you could say the web is all machines, so I think it's a good movement to look at for us specifically. So one of the great modernists, and Richard mentioned him already, Jan Schichold, he wrote this book called Die Neue Typografie, which I read in English. It has some context and some extra explanations. And in his book, he explains kind of what old typography is according to him, and defines a response to that and things we should be changing. Now, one of the things he mentioned about the times that he lived in, this was 1928, and he kind of signaled that in the current day we are getting a lot of printed matter in our hands. That's what he talked about, and that was probably things like newspapers, books probably, but he was worried if we have so much to read, there's this kind of competition going on, because what are people going to read? They need some kind of focus, and how can we get our thing to be read? So for him, he said it would be a whole lot more important to focus on readability, function over form. Clarity, more important than beauty. So the old typography would be things that are very beautifully illustrated and have this really good look. And the new typography would be a whole lot more about making things easier to read and easier to understand, easier to navigate maybe as well. So one of the things that he proposed to do to get better reading experience is to have asymmetric layouts. So rather than having 2 or 3 columns that are exactly the same width, he would propose to have some difference in that, so that you get focus, so that some things are more important than others. You get some kind of visual hierarchy. And you can see in this example, which is an example of readability that he uses in his book, it's not only different sizes of columns, but it's also different like font sizes and different weights of things. And it really helps to navigate what's going on here, and the designer can kind of influence what people see first, because there's differences between things in this design. You see that here as well. He uses color to really make this difference. and he kind of leads you from the one point to the other in this design. Now, one of the things that Seacold found really important that he talked about, and I'm kind of reading between the lines, but he said we should be really intentional about the design choices that we make. So rather than having the same solution for all of our problems, when we get a new problem, we need to think about it afresh, like we need to have a new approach to it. We need to design something for that. Now, another great graphic designer and someone who was hugely influential is Joseph Müller-Brockmann. And he kind of took these principles from Seacold. He was kind of inspired by them, I think. And he wrote this book called Grid Systems. That was many years later. And I think grids are kind of one of the ways to apply Seacold's thinking. Like we need to get more objectivity, more reading experience and things. So grids can help with that. So according to Müller-Brockmann, there's various reasons why you should use grids and kind of advantages that they offer. So they provide like more functional layouts, more logical layouts, and they are also just better to look at. They look prettier. Now, the grid, if you have a bunch of content and you have a surface that you need to put that content on, if you have a grid on the surface, it's a whole lot easier to organize what you are trying to design. So it really aids the designer as well as the reader. I can't really go into how to design grids, because the whole book is about that, and it's probably a conference talk on its own. But he talked about this thing called grid fields, where he would divide the page in like 24 different fields, which he's done here. So it's 4 columns and 6 rows. He, like Seacold, also talked about intentionality, like you need to conceive a fresh solution every time you work on things. And I find this kind of thing inspiring for the web, because we use sometimes layout frameworks, and I won't name names, but they don't give us new solutions to our problems. Something that these graphic designers also really like to do is use proportions between things, for example, golden ratios and other things. And they made sure that there's differences between different parts of the layout that can be rationalized. So there's different numbers, and if you apply the same numbers to different things, you get this kind of consistency. So they really like to use mathematical proportions. Now, you can have an opinion about whether they actually are leading to more beauty, but this is something that they definitely did. Someone else who's interesting, I think, in the history of modernist graphic design is Wim Grauwel, and he is a Dutch graphic designer and kind of the person that introduced modernist graphic design in this country. One thing, an experiment of his is the new alphabet, which is something that he designed because he saw that the monitors they had at the time, they had pixels, which were kind of square, and if you would put a beautiful typeface like Garamond in there, which has like beautiful roundings, you can't really make those roundings with those squares. So those square pixels would look weird, or those designs would look weird if they are built out of squares. So we came up with a design that just had rectangles. And it's very hard to read. It has a new alphabet. The W and the A are slightly weird. But yeah, it does really match that machine reality kind of that he got a response to. And there's various other designs that he got quite famous for, where he uses whitespace very creatively. He does interesting typographical things. He designs fonts specifically for posters, like the Hiroshima font. I found it the other day in a magazine that I bought that was redesigned this year. He was even credited in this, so they credit the author, they credit the photographer, and they also credit Mr. Grauwel as the designer of this font. So it was used in Vrij Nederland, the Dutch magazine. But it wasn't just about like interesting visual things, this modernist stuff. A lot of the work that these people have done was not about museums and musical events like the posters that I've shown before. A lot of it was actually commercial web design, commercial graphic design. So things that they did for big companies, because big companies found out that they needed some kind of visual consistency. They wanted to be recognized by their customers and also trusted by them. So recognizability and trust were really important for those companies, and that's why they wanted corporate identities, or house styles, as they call them in the UK, and later here as well. Design systems 1.0, you could say, because they kind of try to do what we do on the web now, what is now very popular on the web. They did that in print. So one of the first house styles here in the Netherlands was done by KLM. They had this logo, which definitely has some recognizability problems. Imagine this on a plane. It's super far away, you can't really recognize it, and some of the reasons for that is that the illustration is very detailed, and the font is very hard to read. So they asked some American agency to help them with this, and they came up with this, which is a whole lot simpler. It's a simpler illustration. The font is also simpler. And this is easier to recognize. But they refined it even further, because they found it's still quite a complex shape. So they came up with a simpler version of this, where the illustration is now just circles and rectangles. And that is the thing that happened in many of these modernist designs. So agencies started to be founded here in the Netherlands as well, because this redesign of KLM was done by an American agency, and designers here figured out that they wanted to start agencies. So Wim, for example, co-founded the agency called Total Design, and they did all this work for oil companies, but also for the government. They did the phone book that they got famous for. So they did all sorts of different things. Their competitor, Teledesign, did the Dutch railways, and it's very timeless, because you can still see this on trains. They decided to paint the trains yellow, and they're still yellow. They still have this, this logo, which they invented in 1968. Now, it isn't all about design. It's also about standardization. In the last century, they figured out that they could standardize, for example, paper sizes. So they came up with the DIN series, which has like A4 and A5 kind of paper sizes. And they came up with standards for colors as well. And that really helped, because it helped them to do this new graphic design and these kind of corporate identities in a cheaper way, because they could save money by having standardized things and roll these things out across the world. Now, grids also help these people, because if you have your phone number in the same place on your grid, it's going to be easier to process it automatically by computers, which is something they started kind of experimenting with. So you could say there was this kind of modernist graphic design revolution in the last century. And that means things like grids and neutral typefaces, proportions, function over form. They kind of got really popular. And you might think that's great because it looks really cool, but not everyone was a fan of this stuff. People actually ridiculed it, and notably Piet Schreuders, who is here on the left. He is a designer that you might know from his work for VPRO, the Dutch broadcaster, also the Poezerkrant, which is a newspaper that comes out irregularly, and it's about cats. It's pretty cool. But he wrote this book called Layout, kind of an essay or manifesto, and he ridiculed these modernist colleagues of his. He spent pages and pages to kind of make fun of the work they did, because he thinks it's way too simple. They deliver their designs by phone, because it's so simple, they can just tell these people the grid, and they don't need to work very hard. And he made fun of their suits and of their kind of talking. So not everyone liked this modernist graphic design, and other designers like Piet Zwart famously also said it takes all the life out of it. And that is something, I guess, we need to take into account. So too much objectivity probably makes for boring layouts. That's something we need to keep in the back of our minds. Probably should use the good things of modernism there. And I think if we do that, and we use the objectivity part, for example, and the whitespace, those are really good things to take out of modernism and use on the web. And I think CSS is great for that, because it's kind of rules for what websites look like. That's also what I see my job as. So when I get a design, I try to abstract it into design language that is just repeatable rules. It's just CSS, without taking the life out of it, because that's obviously really important. So with that, I think we can really do great graphic design on the web, but let's look at how we could approach that. Mark Bolton applied Jan Schickel's principles earlier. This was in 2012. And I think this is a fantastic article, but a lot has changed since then. So we get a lot of new tools that are now in our browsers. So it's probably time to look at this again. Here are some examples of these tools. So we've seen border radius this morning. We've seen how much time and thinking that takes. But there's lots of other things that are currently implemented in browsers or that are about to come to browsers. So our landscape is really changing when we're doing layout on the web. I won't talk about any of these things. I'll specifically talk about the new layout modes. And I'm saying new, they've been around for a couple of years now, but they are the most recent additions to our layout modes. So they're Flexbox and Grid. And they allow us to do things that we couldn't really do before. For example, equal heights. That was something that I had to build quite often. It would be a design like this. And these cards, they beautifully align, but the reason for that is that they all have exactly the same content. So as a naughty front-end dev, I would put different content in, and it would look something like this. And I'd usually get the designer come back to me and say, well, this is not how I've intended it. Can you make it better? Can you make these things equal heights at the very least? So they would comment on this work because the equal heights weren't there. Now, sometimes I would say, well, this is not how the web works, and we can't really do this, but usually I'd lose the argument and do this with JavaScript and like figure out what the tallest column should be and then calculate this stuff. But we can do this with Flexbox now. So imagine this blue area is the container, and we set display flex to it. At that point, it becomes a flex container. And that means we can use flex properties on it, for example, align items. So when you use flex start, which I've done in this screenshot, all the items will go to the top of this area. That's great, but the default of that is actually stretch. And that's great, because that actually gives us these equal heights that we wanted. Now, whitespace and placement are very important in good graphic design, and that is something that we really can do now with this new tool, specifically with grid layout. And one of the best articles I've read about designing with grid is actually by Wei Jing. She talked about how to do pencil and paper. She uses pencil and paper to do these designs, and this is an example from her article. So she's making that design on the left, and she draws it with pencil and paper, which might seem like something we all know, but it's actually really useful to do when you work with grid. For example, to figure out the difference between flexible and fixed areas. That's what she used it for in this article. I think that's great, and I think we can also use it for whitespace. We can decide which part of this area we want to fill up with content and which parts we want to leave empty. That's something we could never do before, and we can now do with grid. So this is how text works by default. It will just fill up all the available space that you have on your screen, and when it no longer fits, it'll go to the next line, etc. This is what text works like. Now, if we want to design a grid, and I guess Siegel and Müller-Brockmann would kill me if I presented them this, but this is just for the sake of example. It's just 4 columns that we want to put some text in. So if we have the text as before, we have 4 paragraphs that go into a container. What will happen is that each of them will take up the space of one of these things. So how we design the grid, we set display grid to the container, and at that point it becomes a grid container, and we can use grid properties on it. I'm using grid template columns to set the grid, and what I'm doing here is to get 4 different columns that are each one part of the available space, so 1 fraction of the space. Now, what will happen because of auto placement is that because I had 4 paragraphs and I now have 4 columns, they will all take their respective spaces. So the first paragraph will go into the first available space, which is the first column. The second will go into the second column, and so on. So they will just take their spaces like that. But then we've not really made any intentional choices yet. So what we can do is group these items, and then at that point, the group of items is now the only grid item in the grid. So it will take the first available space, which is the first column. Now I can play with this because there's numbers between all these columns, and I can use those to position my text. So I can, for example, make them go between the 2nd and the 4th line, or I can put them in any other position. And as you'll notice, the columns that I don't put any content in, they will just stay there. They won't go away, and they will just be part of your design. That's kind of the point of this example. So leaving an area empty is as easy as filling it up with content. That's something that we haven't had before and that we can now do with grid layouts. And let's just make intentional choices, like Chico recommended us to do. Think about these things. We can make choices where we want to put stuff and which parts we want to leave empty. So that gives us a lot of way for doing composition on the web. But it's important to note that we don't have one single composition. That's something that Vasilis Vergemer blogged about. So as soon as you start scrolling on a web page, your composition moves away from you and it looks different. So that's something we'll probably need to figure out. It's not as easy as on print, I suppose. Now, proportions were another thing that I mentioned in these graphic design examples. They were really important, and they were a bit difficult to do on the web because we had to do percentages. And if I learned anything from following CSS working group people on Twitter, it is that they don't really like percentages because they're quite hard to figure out. Because if someone puts percentages somewhere, you don't necessarily know what they need to be a percentage of. So they can be quite tricky. And for people who write CSS, it's also hard because you need to calculate a lot of stuff. With these new layout modes, this gets a little bit easier. So when I have a Flexbox situation, for example, I can use Flex 2 and Flex 1, for example, and I've created a ratio between 2 and 1 in this example. I don't have to do 2-to-1 ratios. You can change these to any number you like. But the point is, you can do ratios without having to think about how to implement them. You can just say what you want the numbers to be, and they will just work like that. The browser will figure out the maths for you. Same is the case with grid. So you can use fractions. I used fractions before. And you can use any positive number there. So you can, again, create different ratios between these different columns that are there. And more mathematics is maybe coming to the browser. This is a proposal for whitespace distribution. So when you have columns and rows, this whitespace can also have a ratio in between them with the AR unit. That's a proposal that's in the next version of Grid. I think it's not going to make it to the next version, but it is a proposal that is out there and that we can actually comment on as people who write CSS. So if you find it interesting, definitely have a look at that. Now, something that product designers also did was make things proportionate to paper sizes. That was great because they had all these different paper sizes and they were standardized, so they could know what kind of canvas they had and really base their designs on this. Fortunately, that is something we cannot really do on the web because we don't have standardized viewports. Although some people like to think that I still got designs sometimes that are separated between like these viewports, but they are quite random. If you've ever looked at your analytics, you'll notice that you have multiple pages of different resolutions that people use to come to your website with. There's nothing you can do about this. They just come to your website, and that's something we'll have to deal with. So we can't really do anything proportionate to a standardized viewport, but what we can do is make things proportionate to any viewport. Richard mentioned these before, viewport units, so you can use VW and VH. They're numbered between 1 and 100, and they're basically a percentage of the viewport or width or the height. Now we can use these to create our grid. So we can make a grid that's actually responsive to the viewport that we have, just as an experiment. So I've created 8 grid fields in the columns and 8 rows. And here I have a grid that I can use, and that's based on my viewports. So let's put a div of the color tomato in there, one with gold, and we can kind of play with this. And when we look at it in the browser, we can also overlay it with a grid. That's something you can do with the developer tools in Firefox. Now you'll notice that you can also change these, so they can actually adapt to the viewport. And at this point, you'll probably notice that this yellow area is a bit too small to put all your content in, and yeah, you can vary this, because of course media queries work very well together with Grid. One other thing that we can do now in kind of a sensible way is overlap our content. Here's an example of a photo and a bit of content that I've put on a grid. And what you can do is make these two things go into the same cells. That's something that Grid will allow you to do. You can put multiple things into the same place, but at that point they will overlap. And that's something you can actually control with Z and X. You might know this from position absolute. You can also use Z and X to control things. But the good thing about Grid is that these cells will actually grow with the content that goes in them. So it's a bit of more sensible way to do overlapping content. And you can probably do very exciting things with this, more exciting than this example. But yeah, you can definitely do things with this. And you can control the layering there. So yeah, there's a whole lot of other things coming to layout on the web that really make this an exciting field to be in, and really make that, I think we are kind of ready for great graphic design on the web. So that is, again, kind of my question. Are we ready for great graphic design on the web? Now, when I've given workshops about this subject, people have always asked me this question, and it is, will everything look the same in every browser? Now that's, if you've gone to any conference in like the last 10 years, it's something that comes up quite often. And many people, and kind of the people who go to conferences in this inner circle, we kind of know that websites don't need to look the same in every browser. But if you work in a large company, there's likely going to be people there who think everything should look the same everywhere, and that's something you need to work on. So that is the reason that I want to talk to you about this. It's kind of a graph between these things. So you can have your beautiful grid layout or a terrible layout as the alternative. And your beautiful grid layout will work in all the most recent versions of all the browsers. That includes Samsung Internet and Firefox, Opera, Safari. They all do your beautiful grid layout for you. But what some people on your team might ask you to do is actually make it work in all the other browsers as well. Now, this is going to be tricky. CSS is not extensible. We will have Houdini at some point, and that is in some browsers, but definitely not in the browsers that don't support grid layout. So you can't really do that. And if you were able to do it in JavaScript, you would have a lot slower engine to process your JavaScript that the browser can use to process your mods for you. So it's not going to be very effective to try and make this exactly the same. So my recommendation, and this is kind of based on being very practical about it, is to have a simple but pretty okay fallback. So browsers that don't support grid layout, you'll give them a fallback, and that will look different. Now, the ways to do fallbacks, you can look up online, but I'll explain them quickly. So you can use at supports, the cascade, and also override floats. Now, at supports is something you'll all have on your badges. There's a supports query that says which days you are coming to this conference. But what it does is you can put a value in there, for example, display grid, and at that point, the rules that are in between this block will only be executed when the browser supports that property. So you can make specific rules for browsers that support grid. And I think the most likely thing that you'll be doing is resetting your widths and margins, because you'll likely need widths to make kind of a layout. Grid will do that for you, but you'll need to do it if you don't have grid. And for spacing in between things. So that's likely going to be a margin, and you'll want to reset those with supports. Something you might also want to do is undo your floats. And that's something that the spec actually has got covered for you. So it says in the spec for grid layout that as soon as something becomes a grid item, floats no longer work on them. So that means that when you use display grid, your floats are actually automatically be undone for you. And that's quite nice. That means that you don't need to really worry about it. You can float and grid at the same time, and it will work in respective browsers. I think it's very important to keep fallbacks very plain and simple, but that will be a problem. I think it will be. I've spoken to a couple of friends who work for big companies, and they've told me about their journey to implement grid layout. And many of them have said it's really hard to do simple fallbacks because our product owner doesn't like it, or our designer doesn't like it, or some developers don't like it because it's harder to QA if you have a lot of different versions. But still, I think it's good to keep fallbacks very plain and simple by experimenting together. It's not a technical problem, it's a working together kind of problem. A great talk about this is by Michael Laat, who is a designer. She used to be a front-end developer, and she talked to us front-end developers at Frontiers conference a couple of years ago here in Amsterdam. She says we should experiment together a bit more, and she encourages front-end developers to go out to designers and show them what's possible. Because designers go to different conferences, maybe, so they might not know about all these different things. So if you're a CSS developer, it makes a lot of sense to go and show them some code pens that you've created, or some fallbacks, for example. If you're a designer, the same goes. Experiment with this stuff if you want to experiment with it. Apparently, some developers will stop designers from doing this, and I don't think that's a good idea. It's great to experiment with new CSS features. And if you want to do that, you should go for it. Don't ship it to prod, I suppose, because maybe developers will want to fit it into their coding guidelines or stuff, but definitely play with these new possibilities, because they are quite technical, and it will really help to do a good job with them. So yeah, I think we will need to work together and show each other the reality that we live in. That's that reality of our analytics page that has all these different resolutions and all these different browsers. People use different browsers to come to our sites, and that's something we'll need to deal with in a sensible way. Now, I think you can either have more complex code by making a huge fallback that almost exactly mimics what you're doing in the grid, or you can have more talking to colleagues, explaining them that this is your simple fallback and this is the more sensible way to go about it. Because the amount of people that don't have grid layout will actually decrease. So rather than creating a maintainability problem in your code base, it might make more sense to talk to colleagues in the long term and then maybe figure this out together. It's all about finding compromises. That's a good thing to keep in mind when you're working with web design, as Oliver Rijgenstein also said. So I think if we have this fallback scenarios thing figured out, I think the web is really ready for great graphic design. But when I show these slides to Vasilius van Gemert, he asked me, it's quite nice that we can now do all these modernist things in our browsers. It's all right that we've been inspired by these modernists, but can't we make it so that they are inspired by us? Can't we make it so that we have a web that is so interesting that all the print designers want to work on the web rather than on print? So the good thing is that things that were super difficult to do are now built into browsers. But it would be great if we can inspire graphic designers a bit more. Because in my ideal world, a lot of print designers would actually make stuff for the web with all these new tools that we now have built in. We have many non-hacky ways, and I think that's really cool. So that's what my last part is going to be about. How can we make the most out of this new era? So we have these new tools that are in our browsers, almost. We need to do some fallbacking, but we are kind of almost ready for it. How can we make the most out of this? And I think the best way to do that is actually look at some defaults. The web is flexible by default. It is accessible by default. It's interactive. And it's also based on web standards. And these are, I think, 4 things that if we do them really well, we can win in a way. It's not a game, but we can win. So the web is flexible by default. That is great, I think. So where these print designers would have fixed canvases and know what their content would be, sometimes up to like character counts. If you work at a newspaper, you probably know exactly how many characters are going to have to fit in your column. They knew about colors, kind of sure about those things. And this is something we don't have on the web. So our canvases are super flexible. There's a lot of different people coming to our sites. We don't know what our content is going to be because we have CMSs and user-generated content. And also, color options are weird. Not only do people have like black and white Kindles that they can visit your site with, we also have differences between browsers. So there's differences between Firefox and Chrome and how they display our colors. One great article about flexibility on the web is A Tao of Web Design by John Alsop. It's the article, if you don't know it, that sparked this whole responsive design revolution. He talks about dealing with flexibility in a way that is kind of zen. We need to let go. So rather than trying to make everything fixed and try and make it work, it's actually a whole lot more effective to let it go and just embrace the flexibility that we have there. We can make our work more effective, for example, by focusing on what the users actually came to your site for. So maybe they want to apply for a passport, or they want to purchase a TV, or get a new insurance or something. They are not going to be scared away by columns that are not exactly the right proportion. You can still make things that are on brand if you embrace the flexibility. So one way to do that is by using some flexible properties in your CSS and kind of embracing that. So it's about letting go control, because if you use fixed things, like you say this needs to be exactly 300 pixels, you have control. That's quite nice. But the thing is, if you use these flexible units, you can have more advantages, because you can let the browser make decisions for you. So let's say we want to have a 50 characters width column. This is something that graphic designers sometimes recommend. If you want to have a readable column, think about the amount of characters that goes into each line, and you can get good readability. So that's what I've done here. I've created 3 columns. The left and the right one are 1 fraction, so they both get some of the available space. They each get half of that. And then the middle column is 50 characters. That's great, because then that middle column will always have our good reading experience, as long as it's like paragraph-sized text, because that's based on the body size. But we can also use min-max if we are not sure. And this is something that these graphic designers also say. It doesn't need to be exactly 50 characters. Make it somewhere in between this range. And that's something that is now available in CSS. So you can actually say, I want this column to be in between 45 and 70 characters. You're giving away a lot of control, because you don't know exactly how wide it's going to be. But the thing that you do know is that it's going to be a nice and readable column. And that's probably all that matters. So a browser will figure it out here for you. So if you have a very small viewport, it will likely go to like the 45 end of the spectrum. And if you have a huge screen, it will make it larger. You don't need to worry about it. It will just sort it out for you. Another great thing about the web is that it is accessible by default. Now, the reason for that is that it is mostly text. And that is very helpful, because you can select text, you can copy-paste it into other things. You can have it read out by screen readers, which is awesome. You don't need to record a voice that reads out your whole website. This will actually work already, because your website is all text, and screen readers can interpret that. You can make it larger if you can't see very well, and you can also put it into Google Translate. And I think these are all traits that let us kind of have accessibility automatically, because we have everything in text. That's something that you can't do on a print poster. Once you've produced it and you've hung it on the wall or in the metro station or somewhere else, that is going to be that poster, and it has some different requirements, because you need to be able to see, for example, to know what's on the poster. So this accessibility that comes for free with the web is actually a great feature. I was looking at this website for a cinema in Taiwan, and I noticed this menu at the top that I couldn't really read. It's, I guess, a beautiful graphic design, but what they've done is they've actually used photos or pictures of these menu items. There's no text here, also no alternative text in the image, and that meant that I couldn't copy-paste the individual items there, and that's kind of what I wanted to do at that point, because I didn't know which link would give me the tickets. So I wanted to copy-paste it into Google Translate to figure out what was going on there. If you use images, that's not going to work. If you build this beautiful graphic design with CSS, that is going to work. So you're giving your users some features that they can then use. Another thing, here's a poster that I saw in a book, and I've decided to recreate that in HTML. And again, that gives you a couple of features. For example, I can look at it without CSS. It's a great way to consume that information for maybe some people, maybe for some machines. They can index it into their search engines, for example. And you can also translate posters that way. If you build them in CSS, it's really easy to then have a translation. So yeah, I think kind of my point here is that text is actually better than images of text, and printed posters are images of text in a way. If you have real text, you get these advantages for free. And the web is also interactive by default, and that gives us a lot of chances to make our designs even more enjoyable and more pleasurable. For example, you can have focus indicators to figure out where you are. So if you're filling out the form field, it will have this beautiful blue glow around it so that you can see which field you're currently filling in. If you've gone out for a coffee and you come back, you can still see where you were. You can hide and show stuff, so you don't need to put all your content onto the canvas. You can make it show on demand. And transitions can make web design a whole lot more pleasurable, as we heard yesterday from Benjamin. That really helps. And we can do this with old print design posters, as this cool website, swissandcss.com, have done. So they've animated these posters, and I think that could work quite well. I imagine these posters for musical events, they would be hanging in metro stations at the time. They could put these on screens. They built them in HTML and CSS, and they could put them in screens, and they would be more pleasurable. Doesn't have to be a website. And the last thing I want to say is that the web is built on web standards. And that's also incredibly valuable, I think, especially if we understand the standards themselves. So if we try and get into these nitty-gritty details of all these different CSS specifications, I think that's extremely useful because it will help you do better designs. Now, I've drawn another diagram between web standards and frameworks that abstract these web standards, because that's kind of the reality in modern development, that we really like to abstract things into frameworks. So an example of a web standard is DisplayFlex, and the great thing about it is that you can look it up in a spec, which is this long document. It's quite readable. You can find all the details there, but maybe some people don't like doing that. I do, some people don't, that's fine. But you can also go to other resources. For example, CSS Tricks or the Mozilla Developer Network. They have all this stuff really explained out there. Another thing is that these things have been invented for many, many years. So people spend like 5-6 years, some of the smartest people in our industry, to come up with these standards and put them into browsers. And the browsers have implemented them consistently. I think that's really cool and something we should keep in mind when we work with CSS, that this actual CSS is really great to use. Compared, for example, to using mixins. This is a mixin that takes care of your Flexbox for you. And as someone who knows quite a bit about Flexbox, I don't really know what that means. What does doing my Flexbox for me really come down to? It sets some properties, but which ones does it set? Is that in any standard? Probably not. So it's a project maintained by a number of people, which will really, I guess it saves people time, but it also is harder to look up, especially if you do that in 10 years. It's not as timeless as these web standards are. That's kind of what I wanted to say. And frameworks that abstract them, I guess that takes it a step further. So things like Bootstrap and Suzy, they were extremely helpful at a time when we didn't have layout tools in our browsers that we could use. But now they kind of get into our way because they will stay in your code base, and they're kind of hard to remove once you've put them in. So the inventor of Suzy actually said a couple of weeks ago at the Beyond Telegram conference that C no longer uses Suzy, and that C recommends using Grid instead. Now, Bootstrap is a specific case. It has 204 class names, and it does all the mats for you, so all the mats for your layout. But the problem with it is that it has too many class names, because it does the mats for all the other layouts as well. So it has kind of too many class names, and I guess that's a little bit of overhead that you can probably survive. But it also has 2 view class names, because it doesn't do, for example, the proportions that we might want to use. So for example, maybe you want 4 out of 9 or 5 out of 9. You can do that with Flexbox or with Grid, but you can't really do that in Bootstrap, because everything has to be based on these 12-column things. So although it is helpful for prototyping, and it has been helpful for large teams to do layout in a world where layout wasn't really possible on the web, I think in this new era where we have all these new things, we can actually use web standards themselves. So yeah, I'm recommending choosing vanilla and kind of being here for our skill. So if you want to do that, if you want to learn more about grid layout, there's a number of resources that you could go to. For example, this blog post by Jen Simmons. There's also a layout workshop online on gridbyexample.com by Rachel Andrew. It's a great resource for this. There's also playful things, like you can play with carrots or frogs and these sorts of things. And you can play with alignment there and learn these properties that way. Like I said, I think it's really helpful to know the actual properties rather than trying to find a framework that automatically does them for us, because it lets us do more creative things ourselves, in a way. So yeah, I think we can do all these cool new things now that I've shown you. And the slides that I've shown are not very exciting, and that's because I want to encourage you to make actual cool things with these possibilities. I've tried to show only the basic possibilities, and I think we can really make very cool things with this. So we can now do all these cool things, and I think we can win. We can thrive in a way by being flexible, accessible, interactive, and standards-based. I think that's really, really cool if we stick to those principles. So that's kind of what I wanted to end with. I think it's a great time to be doing graphic design on the web. That's all for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. I've got a few questions from the audience. So something sort of early on, when you were talking about the sort of use of CSS Grid to do design, the fact we've got this flexible grid and we can do proportions. If you're working with a designer, what sort of grid should they be using in order to work with you to actually create that? I mean, how do they see this if we're talking about something which can change in proportions based on the content, for example?
I think that's a great question. I think in the kind of Bootstrap era, designers would say, are you using Bootstrap or Foundation? And they would go like, then I'll do that in my design software.
Yeah.
I think with Grid, and I guess with Flexbox to some point, that's actually something we'll need to do together. So we'll need to experiment together, and maybe, yeah, people need to sit together and kind of play with this together. I think that's the only way, or it needs to be built into tools, but I guess the browser would be our tool there.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's that thing of, I've been building websites for a long time, and we used to kind of sort of throw the thing over the fence, a Photoshop document. And I mean, with responsive design, we said, oh, that's got to go away. And I think now to take advantage of this, yeah. It
hasn't really gone away as much as we'd hoped.
No, no, it hasn't.
That's why I mentioned it again.
It's kind of a workflow thing rather than a tools thing, I guess. Really interesting question about the things that often we're talking about as being good design. Is that actually something that works across cultures? Are we making choices about what's good, or even developing new CSS based on those ideas of what's good? And that's actually a very Western idea of what's good. Do you see that perhaps happening?
Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of that we look at here, all the graphic designers, these are even mostly Dutch examples and like German and Swiss examples. And yeah, there's a whole world out there where they might have very different opinions about things. But Western world is not the only thing. I guess in a lot of new CSS, we've also taken into account things like writing modes and languages have been thought of more than maybe before.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to see what happens, with design coming from other cultures and how how we can involve that. Yeah. So, what would you actually like to see next, and what feature, whether that's a feature of Grid or just something totally new, what do you think would enable really cool new stuff?
I think some of the things I showed on one slide, like having floats that aren't rectangular, I think that's something that can make things really, really interesting and very different from what we're used to. Yeah. Maybe less rectangular things.
Moving away from little boxes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks for having me.